Royal was 68 when he first began to notice something unusual, though at the time he brushed it off as just another part of getting older. He had always been a steady man, the kind who woke up with the sun, walked to the corner cafe for his coffee, and read the morning paper before the world grew noisy. Friends knew him as dependable, calm, and thoughtful. But beneath that calm, a small disruption had begun, one that seemed harmless in the daylight but grew louder when the night came. Each evening, as the house quieted and the lights dimmed, Royal found himself waking again and again, hurrying to the bathroom, unable to rest the way he once did. At first he told himself it was just age. After all, what man past 60 didn't deal with midnight interruptions? But as the weeks stretched into months, those nightly trips became more than an inconvenience. They became a shadow that followed him into his days. He grew tired more quickly, his patience thinned, and the sparkle in his eyes dulled. His wife noticed how he lingered at the kitchen table, head heavy in his hands, too weary to finish the stories he once loved to tell his grandchildren. Something inside him was being stolen, slowly, almost silently. The real turning point came during a routine checkup. His doctor, a man not much younger than Royal himself, leaned forward with concern. "Your prostate is enlarged," he said gently, "and I want you to think about what you're eating. Sometimes the very foods we believe are keeping us strong are the ones making things worse." Royal sat in that office stunned. He had always prided himself on eating healthy. A bowl of fruit each morning, a banana tucked in his jacket pocket, grapes set out on the kitchen counter. Could it be that the very choices he thought were protecting him were quietly fueling his troubles? That question echoed through him all the way home. He thought of the pineapple he had carved just 2 nights before, the orange slices he had packed for his grandchildren, the watermelon that seemed to cool him during summer evenings. Each memory now carried a trace of unease. That night, as he rose once again from bed, he paused at the doorway and looked back at his wife, asleep beneath the lamp's gentle glow. He realized this wasn't just about him, it was about the life they had built together, the morning she hoped he'd be there to share, the stories yet untold. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Royal's journey didn't begin with drastic change. It began with a quiet awareness, a choice to listen to the signals his body had been sending all along. The more he learned, the more he understood that health after 60 wasn't about adding more and more, but about knowing what to let go of, especially the hidden culprits disguised as healthy. With each small adjustment, a little strength returned. He still had far to go, but for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope that his nights might once again be peaceful, and his days filled with the calm he thought he had lost forever. Royal had always been a man of quiet habits. At 68, he kept his evenings simple, an early dinner with his wife, a short walk through the garden, and then a book by his bedside lamp. For years, this rhythm had given him peace. Yet lately, that peace had been breaking apart, piece by piece. He found himself jolted awake at least 3, sometimes 4 times each night. The soft comfort of his bed no longer felt like a refuge, but a station he kept leaving and returning to. Restless, never truly rested. He didn't speak of it much at first. Pride had always been stitched into the fabric of his character. He told himself it was natural, that age carried with it countless inconveniences, and this was simply one of them. But deep down, the nightly interruptions cut him more than he admitted. By morning, his eyes sagged with fatigue and his mind felt wrapped in fog. When his grandchildren asked him to play their favorite card game after breakfast, he tried to keep up, but his patience thinned too quickly. He could no longer find the words to tell his stories with the same spark, and it left him silently grieving a part of himself. The truth dawned on him one night, standing barefoot in the dark hallway. He leaned against the wall, steadying his balance, listening to the echo of his own unsteady breath. The sound of his wife's gentle snore drifted from the bedroom, and for a moment he felt separated from her, like there was a quiet gulf opening between them. Not because she didn't care, but because he no longer shared the same rest. She woke with ease each morning while he dragged his tired body forward. He realized then that what seemed like just a nuisance was beginning to shape his days in ways he could no longer ignore. A few weeks later, Royal visited his doctor. The man was older too, perhaps in his early 70s, and spoke with the kind of gentleness that came from years of seeing patients who carried unspoken fears. After listening carefully, the doctor placed a hand on Royal's shoulder and said, "Your prostate is enlarged. It's common at your age, but common doesn't mean harmless. Sometimes what you eat is quietly making things worse. I want you to think about your fruit bowl." Royal blinked, caught off guard. His fruit bowl? Surely that couldn't be it. He had always believed fruit was the purest form of health, a gift from nature. That night, the doctor's words circled in his mind. He thought of the golden slices of pineapple he loved to prepare on Sundays, the bright citrus juice he drank to start his mornings, the bananas stacked neatly on the kitchen counter. Could these familiar comforts be the very reason he now shuffled half awake through shadowed hallways? The thought unsettled him, yet it also lit a small fire of curiosity. If food could quietly work against him, perhaps food could also become his ally. Perhaps the answer wasn't in pills or resigning himself to old age, but in listening differently, to his body, to his habits, and to the signals he had ignored for too long. Royal sat by his window the following morning, tea in hand, watching the light stretch across the garden. He promised himself something then. He would begin to pay attention, not just to his symptoms, but to the choices leading up to them. The restless nights were no longer something he could dismiss. They were warnings, whispering truths he needed to face. For the first time in a long while, he felt a shift. Not yet relief, but the beginning of a journey he hadn't expected to take. And it all started with the quiet realization that even the sweetest fruit could carry a hidden sting. Royal's wife, Margaret, had always admired his small Sunday ritual. He would buy a ripe pineapple from the corner market, set it on the cutting board, and with steady hands carve away its rough skin until the golden flesh shone bright. The slices, arranged neatly in a bowl, became a symbol of care, something sweet he could share with her and the grandchildren when they visited. For years, he believed it was one of the healthiest things he could offer his family, a tropical gift in their ordinary kitchen. But one evening, after Margaret set the fruit on the table, Royal hesitated. The doctor's words echoed, "Think about your fruit bowl." He stared at the pineapple, at the bright juice glistening under the kitchen light, and something inside him tightened. He remembered the night before, rising again and again, the ache in his lower belly, the uneasy pressure that left him awake until dawn. He wondered, with a mix of doubt and fear, if this beloved fruit had something to do with it. That night he ate only a small piece, watching carefully how his body responded. Hours later, when he found himself once again shuffling to the bathroom, the thought returned with more force. Maybe it wasn't coincidence. Maybe the sweetness he cherished carried a hidden burden. By morning, his suspicion grew. He sat at the kitchen table, weary-eyed, pushing the leftover pineapple aside. Margaret noticed his silence and asked what troubled him. He explained haltingly about the doctor's warning, about his doubts, about the possibility that something so innocent might be stirring the unrest in his nights. Margaret listened with the patience of a woman who had shared decades with him. She nodded softly and said, "Then perhaps we need to test it. Leave it aside for a while, Royal. Let's see what happens." Her calmness steadied him. He agreed, though inside he felt an odd grief, like giving up a piece of comfort that had been with him for years. It was only fruit, and yet it carried memory, routine, love. Over the next week, Royal avoided pineapple. The first nights were no miracle. He still woke often, still felt the frustration of interrupted rest. But by the fifth night, something shifted. He slept longer before the first urge woke him. It wasn't perfect, but it was noticeable. For the first time in months, he felt a sliver of relief. He told Margaret, and she smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the smallest changes speak the loudest," she said. Curiosity led him to read more quietly in the evenings. He discovered that pineapple, though praised for its vitamin C and its enzyme bromelain, also carried a heavy load of natural sugar and acidity. For younger bodies, it might not matter, but for him, at 68, with an already swollen prostate, it was like throwing sparks on dry grass. The thought unsettled him. He realized he had been feeding himself something that quietly worked against his peace, believing all the while it was a gift of health. The realization didn't bring anger, but a kind of humbled clarity. He remembered his father, who had struggled with similar troubles in his later years, pacing the hall at night while Royal, then a boy, watched with worry. Back then, no one spoke of it. His father never explained, never complained, just endured. Now, decades later, Royal understood. He saw himself in those quiet footsteps, and he wondered how much of that pain could have been eased with just a little more awareness. One evening, when the grandchildren visited, Margaret served blueberries instead of pineapple. The children popped them into their mouths happily, staining their fingers purple, laughing with delight. Royal joined them, tasting the gentle sweetness. It felt lighter, easier somehow, without the sharp tang of pineapple that lingered in his throat. And later that night, When he woke only once, he thought perhaps this small substitution was not a loss but a gift, an adjustment that might allow him to reclaim what mattered most. Restful nights, brighter mornings, the strength to laugh and play without exhaustion pulling him back. In that quiet victory, Royal learned his first lesson, not through lectures or long lists, but through the soft rhythm of lived experience. Sometimes the foods we trust most can quietly betray us, and sometimes choosing differently, even in small ways, opens the door to a life less burdened by pain. The mornings had always carried a special rhythm for Royal. He would shuffle into the kitchen, open the blinds just enough to let the sunlight in, and pour himself a tall glass of orange juice. The tangy sweetness was his daily companion, the spark that seemed to wake his body when his mind was still heavy with dreams. Margaret often teased him, saying, "Royal, you love that juice more than your tea." And perhaps he did. For decades, he had believed that glass of citrus was a symbol of vitality, a defense against colds, a way of keeping strong as he aged. But after the pineapple revelation, Royal's trust in familiar comforts was no longer as steady. One morning, as he lifted the glass to his lips, he felt an unease. The memory of restless nights returned, his body aching, bladder tight, the soft creak of the hallway floorboards under his bare feet. He wondered, could this golden liquid, so bright and alive, be another hidden culprit? He set the glass down without drinking, watching the pulp swirl slowly, as if the juice itself were whispering a warning he had ignored for too long. That week, he experimented. Some mornings he skipped the juice, replacing it with plain water or a handful of pears Margaret had sliced. The difference wasn't immediate, but subtle changes surfaced. On days without citrus, his body seemed calmer, the irritation less sharp. His bathroom visits didn't disappear, but they lost the urgency that once forced him from bed like a prisoner to his own body. He began to notice patterns, and with each small discovery, he felt the faint stirrings of control returning to him. One afternoon, he shared his suspicions with Margaret while they walked slowly through their garden. She listened quietly, her hand resting on his arm. "You've always trusted what you've been told, Royal," she said gently. "But maybe now it's time to listen to yourself. Not every habit is meant to last forever." Her words carried no judgment, only tenderness. And in that moment, Royal realized this journey wasn't just about him. It was about how they both would navigate the years ahead, together, adapting, learning, choosing. A few days later, their eldest son visited. He noticed Royal pushing away the bowl of sliced oranges on the table and raised an eyebrow. "Dad, since when don't you eat oranges? You always told us fruit was the best thing we could eat." Royal chuckled, a little embarrassed, but then spoke honestly. "I used to believe that without question, but my nights, they've been different. I think some of these fruits are working against me." His son fell silent, thoughtful, before nodding slowly. "Maybe that's wisdom, Dad, knowing when to hold on and when to let go." That night, Royal reflected on those words. All his life, he had been the one giving advice, guiding his children, showing them how to mend what was broken. But now, in the quiet hours of his 60s, he was the one learning humility, learning that health was not a straight path, but a winding road filled with turns he had never expected. The orange juice that once seemed like sunshine in a glass had become a reminder that even the brightest things could cast shadows when held too long. He didn't give up citrus entirely. Sometimes he still enjoyed a slice with his dinner or a drop of lemon in his tea. But the ritual of the morning glass was gone, replaced by softer choices, fruits that nourished without stinging his body. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the nights began to ease. He no longer rose with the same frantic urgency. There were still interruptions, yes, but they no longer ruled him. For Royal, that was progress, not perfection, but a step toward reclaiming the life that the darkness of night had tried to steal. And with each step, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. The quiet hope that perhaps age did not mean surrender, but simply learning how to walk differently, one choice at a time. For as long as Royal could remember, bananas had been his faithful companion. When he worked at the factory in his younger years, he carried one in his lunchbox because it never bruised easily. When his children were small, he peeled bananas for them in the park, handing them over like small golden treasures that kept sticky fingers happy. Even now, decades later, a bunch of bananas still hung in his kitchen, dangling from the wooden hook Margaret had insisted they buy years ago. To him, bananas weren't just fruit, They were a symbol of ease, comfort, and familiarity. One evening after dinner, Royal reached for one without thinking. The peel opened with its familiar sound, and he felt the weight of routine in his hands. But as he took a bite, a flicker of doubt stirred in him. He had felt stronger these past weeks, sleeping longer stretches, waking fewer times in the night. Could this simple banana, soft and harmless in appearance, be yet another quiet trigger, like the pineapple and citrus before it? The thought made him pause. He set it aside half-finished, an unusual act that caught Margaret's eye. Later that night, the bathroom door creaked open again and again. Royal leaned against the sink, staring at his reflection, weary and restless. The connection was too sharp to ignore. By morning, he felt as though the fruit he once trusted most had turned on him. He told Margaret, and she listened with a mixture of sadness and practicality. "Perhaps it's time," she said softly. "You've given your life to old habits, but maybe it's time to loosen their grip." Her words carried the weight of truth, though hearing them stung. Over the next few days, Royal began noticing subtleties he had long overlooked. Bananas, though gentle in taste, seemed to sit heavily in him. His body felt sluggish, as though the fruit left behind a weight that slowed him. He remembered something his doctor had mentioned about potassium and how older kidneys struggled to balance fluids. The idea lingered like a shadow. Could it be that the fruit which once kept him strong was now quietly tipping his body into imbalance, pressing against an already fragile system? The realization left him unsettled. He thought back to moments from his childhood, watching his father eat bananas each morning, believing it kept him hardy for long days of labor. Royal had inherited the same habit without question, carrying it like an unspoken family tradition. Now, as he stared at the half-ripe bunch on the counter, he felt a pang of grief, as though letting go of bananas meant letting go of a part of his history. But then something happened that softened the weight of that grief. His granddaughter Clara came over one afternoon with a small bowl of strawberries she had picked with her school friends. She offered them with the proud smile only a child could wear. Royal took one, biting into its tender sweetness. It wasn't the sturdy comfort of a banana, it was lighter, fresher, a spark instead of a blanket. That night, he noticed he woke only once, and even then, he drifted back to sleep quickly. The next morning, when Clara asked if he liked the strawberries, Royal smiled and said, "More than I expected." From then on, the bananas on the hook no longer called to him the way they once had. He still allowed himself one occasionally, but the grip of habit had loosened. He began to see that change didn't have to mean loss. Sometimes it meant rediscovering the small joys that had been overlooked, like the tart sweetness of strawberries, the soft bite of pears. And in those rediscoveries, Royal felt not only relief in his body, but also a renewal of spirit. Bananas, he realized, had taught him an unexpected lesson, that even the most familiar comforts could turn burdensome if held too tightly. Letting go was not a betrayal of the past, but a gift to the present. And for Royal, who had lived so long by routine, that awareness was a quiet but profound transformation. For Royal, nothing spoke of summer more vividly than the sound of a knife slicing into a ripe watermelon. The crack of the rind, the rush of pink flesh glistening under the kitchen light, it was like a promise of laughter, of long afternoons when his children were young and the backyard echoed with splashes from a plastic pool. Even now, at 68, just the sight of a watermelon carried him back to those days, when life felt simple and light. He loved nothing more than sitting outside on a warm evening, a thick wedge in his hand, juice dripping down his wrist as he watched the sky soften into dusk. But after weeks of paying closer attention to his body, Royal began to wonder whether the very fruit he cherished most was quietly adding to his unrest. One humid evening, after sharing slices with Margaret on the porch, he woke 3 times before midnight. Each trip down the hallway left him more drained, his legs heavy, his chest tight with frustration. He sat on the edge of the bed at dawn, head bowed, and whispered to himself, "I can't keep living like this." The sweetness of watermelon no longer tasted like joy, it had turned into a kind of betrayal. The following day, he confided in Margaret. She frowned, her hands still wet from rinsing dishes, and said, "Royal, maybe it's the water itself. You know how much is in that fruit. Perhaps your body just can't keep up anymore." Her words struck him with both clarity and sadness. Watermelon had always been his refuge, the one fruit that felt more like water than food. And yet, perhaps that was the problem. His bladder, already pressured by his swollen prostate, simply could not bear the flood. He tried to resist the idea, but the pattern became undeniable. On nights without watermelon, his rest was lighter but steadier. On nights when he indulged, his body betrayed him, rushing him down the hallway again and again. Each time he felt a mixture of irritation and grief, as though he were giving up not just a food, but a memory, a piece of his younger self that had carried him into old age. One weekend, his daughter came by with her family, bringing a large melon as a gift. She set it proudly on the counter, unaware of the quiet storm it stirred in her father. Royal smiled politely, but felt a pang of conflict. When she cut it open and handed him a slice, he hesitated. His grandchildren devoured theirs with the same delight he once knew, juice running down their chins. He watched them, caught between joy and sorrow, before setting his piece down untouched. His daughter noticed and asked softly, "Dad, aren't you having any?" Royal shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Not today," he said. "Some things don't sit with me the way they used to." That night, free of watermelon, Royal slept almost straight through, waking only once before dawn. The relief was small but profound. In the morning, as sunlight poured across the kitchen floor, he realized that choosing not to eat watermelon hadn't stolen his memories. The joy of those summer evenings still lived in him, carried in the laughter of his grandchildren, in the sound of their bare feet slapping against the porch. The fruit had been part of it, yes, but it was never the source of it. Royal understood then that letting go of watermelon was not an act of loss, but of love, for his own health, for the peace it gave him, for the strength it allowed him to share more fully with the people who mattered most. He no longer needed the fruit to anchor his memories. They were already woven into him, unshaken, untouched. And in that realization, the ache of parting softened, replaced by something gentler, gratitude for the past and hope for nights that might finally be restful again. In Royal's kitchen, there was always a bowl of grapes resting on the counter. Margaret kept them there, knowing how easily the grandchildren's hands reached for them. Grapes were effortless, no peeling, no slicing, just a gentle tug from the stem, a burst of sweetness in the mouth. Royal loved them too. He had always thought of grapes as harmless, even noble, a fruit often praised for its antioxidants and heart-friendly nature. When his doctor had warned him about his fruit bowl, grapes were the last thing he thought to question. But one late afternoon, after an unusually restless night, he found himself staring at the half-empty bowl. He replayed the evening before in his mind. He had eaten handful after handful while reading in his chair, never once thinking they could do him harm. Yet his body had responded with urgency all through the night, dragging him from bed, filling the hours with interruptions instead of dreams. He felt weary as he looked at the little green orbs. Could something so small be the cause of such exhaustion? That evening he mentioned it to Margaret. She paused, her hand resting on the back of his chair, and said, "Royal, sometimes it isn't the size of the thing, but how much of it you let in." Her words lingered with him long after she left the room. He thought of the sugar that grapes carried, disguised in their lightness, and the tannins hidden in their skins, sharp against his bladder even if his tongue barely noticed. He began to see grapes differently, not as harmless snacks, but as tiny saboteurs working quietly against him. For a week, he avoided them. Instead of reaching for grapes, he took small bowls of blueberries or sliced pears. To his surprise, he felt lighter. His nights, though not perfect, carried longer stretches of rest. The pressure eased, the gnawing urgency softened, and with every morning that greeted him with clearer eyes and a calmer body, his suspicion grew into certainty. Grapes, too, were not his friends anymore. The realization saddened him more than he expected. Grapes had been there at birthday parties, at weddings, at countless dinners shared with loved ones. They were woven into his memory like threads of sweetness. To let them go felt like saying farewell to a dear companion. But Royal had begun to learn that letting go was not an ending, it was an opening. In place of grapes, he discovered other joys: strawberries from Clara, pears from the market, blueberries that stained his fingertips. Each new choice was not a replacement, but a renewal, a reminder that life still held variety, still held kindness, even in small bowls of fruit. One Sunday, when the family gathered, Margaret set the table with pears and berries instead of grapes. The grandchildren hardly noticed, laughing as they reached for whatever was closest. Royal watched them with quiet gratitude. He realized the traditions he thought were bound to certain fruits were not bound at all. They lived in the laughter, the conversation, the warmth of being together. Grapes had been part of that, yes, but not the heart of it. And as he looked around at the people who filled his home, he felt no loss, only peace. That night, Royal lay in bed and listened to the steady rhythm of Margaret's breathing beside him. For the first time in years, he slept almost undisturbed, his body no longer at war with itself. He realized then that his journey had never truly been about fruit. It was about learning to listen to the quiet signals of his body, to the wisdom tucked inside discomfort, to the truths whispered by age. Pineapple, citrus, bananas, watermelon, grapes. They had each taught him something, not just about food, but about letting go, about choosing with intention, about finding strength in change. As the dawn light crept across the room, Royal opened his eyes and felt a calm he had almost forgotten. He knew the years ahead would not be perfect, but they could be gentler, freer, and in that gentleness he found hope, not only for himself, but for every man his age who thought restless nights were simply the price of growing old. They didn't have to be. Sometimes, all it took was the courage to look at a bowl of fruit and ask, is this truly nourishing me or quietly holding me back? Royal's journey was never about giving up fruit. It was about listening to his body in a way he never had before. He began with restless nights, worn thin by the constant pull of an overworked bladder. At first, he thought it was simply age, something he must endure. But step by step, he discovered the truth hidden in plain sight. Some of the very fruits he trusted were quietly working against him. Pineapple, once his Sunday delight, had been fueling inflammation. Citrus, his morning ritual, was adding irritation to an already sensitive system. Bananas, watermelon, even grapes, all carried small burdens that grew heavy over time. And yet, when he gently set them aside, he found new space in his days and nights. The urgency softened, his sleep grew steadier, and his mornings returned to him with a clarity he thought he had lost forever. Royal's transformation was not dramatic. It was patient, mindful, and deeply human. He learned that health after 60 is not about holding tightly to every habit, but about choosing with wisdom. Sometimes what we let go of matters more than what we keep. And so I invite you to reflect, just as Royal did. Listen closely to your body. Notice the small signals. Ask yourself whether the choices you make each day are lifting you up or quietly weighing you down. You may find, as Royal did, that even the smallest change can open the door to rest, comfort, and freedom. Because at the end of it all, growing older is not about surrendering to loss, it is about discovering gentler ways to live. And with each wise choice, we give ourselves not only longer nights of rest, but brighter mornings of hope.